August 15, 1945. The guns fell silent. Not gradually, not with the slow exhalation of a dying fire, but abruptly, as though God himself had drawn a curtain across the sky and declared the spectacle over. Across the Pacific, across the green hills of Europe, across the harbor mouths and industrial valleys and factory towns of the American continent, the anti-aircraft batteries that had stood vigil for 4 grinding years now pointed their barrels at an empty sky. The smoke that had curled from those great muzzles, from the squat, powerful 90mm M1 and the towering 120mm M1 that required 15 men to operate, dissipated in the summer heat. The radar dishes that had swept the heavens in restless arcs slowed to a stop, and the young American soldiers who had fed shell after shell into the mechanical hunger of those weapons leaned against the steel carriages, exhaled, and allowed themselves, perhaps for the first time in years, to simply look upward without fear. Those guns had been forged from the most extraordinary industrial mobilization in the history of human civilization. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced no fewer than 257,000 artillery pieces of all varieties. Among them tens of thousands of dedicated anti-aircraft weapons. President Franklin Roosevelt had called, in the early days of America's entry into the war, for the staggering production of 55,000 anti-aircraft guns alone. The American arsenal responded. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, standardized in March of 1940, was produced by a chain of 30 separate contractors working in concert. By 1945, more than 133,000 units of the M1 and M2 variants had been completed and distributed to every theater of war. Each gun cost roughly $50,000 to manufacture. Each one represented thousands of hours of labor, mountains of precision machined steel, and the quiet, determined output of factory workers in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and beyond, men and women who had never seen a battlefield but whose hands built the instruments of its decision. The 90mm gun was, in its time, a marvel. With a barrel measuring 15 feet in length, capable of hurling a 23-pound shell to an altitude of 43,500 feet, nearly 8 miles straight up, it was the American answer to Germany's feared 88mm flak gun. Where the German 88 became a symbol of Wehrmacht precision and terror, the American 90mm became something equally formidable, a symbol of democratic mass production, of the industrial republic's ability to manufacture lethality at scale. And behind the gun stood the equally revolutionary variable time, or VT, proximity fuse. A tiny radio transmitter embedded in the nose of each shell, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, which caused the projectile to detonate automatically when it passed within lethal range of an enemy aircraft. It was this fuse, this small, humble cylinder of American ingenuity, that would transform anti-aircraft gunnery from a game of probability into something approaching certainty. In August of 1944, along the English Channel coast, American anti-aircraft batteries using 90mm guns fitted with VT proximity fuses shot down 89 of 91 German V-1 flying bombs in a single engagement. 89 out of 91. A rate of lethality that stunned Allied commanders and terrified those across the Channel who had launched them. Heavier still was the 120mm M1 gun. A weapon so massive it weighed 64,000 pounds in full operational configuration, required a crew of 15 men, and could send its 50-pound shell to a ceiling of nearly 60,000 feet. Produced in smaller numbers than the 90mm due to its sheer size and logistical demands, the 120mm was nevertheless deployed at the most critical nodes of the American defense network, around plutonium production plants, key naval installations, and the great industrial hearts of the nation. Alongside these behemoths stood the nimble, rapid-firing Bofors 40mm automatic cannon, a Swedish design licensed and mass-produced by American factories in Akron, Ohio and elsewhere. The Bofors was the most widely used anti-aircraft weapon of the entire war, used by nearly every major Allied and Axis nation across every theater, and American industry manufactured it in staggering quantities. Where the 90mm and 120mm hunted high-altitude bombers, the Bofors and its smaller companions devoured low-flying attackers, filling the sky with a curtain of steel that few aircraft could penetrate without paying a terrible price. Together, these weapon systems formed the backbone of America's anti-aircraft artillery, the AAA, as the soldiers called it, or AAA. The men who served them were not glamorous warriors. They did not fly. They did not maneuver through bocage hedgerows or storm across Pacific beaches. They stood in fixed positions, often in rain, often in mud, peering through optical directors and listening for the distant drone of engines. They were the sentinels. And for 4 years, they had done their work magnificently. Not only overseas, where batteries from North Africa to Okinawa had imposed a terrible toll on enemy aviation, but at home, where anti-aircraft gun positions had been hastily erected in city parks, along harbor approaches, and on the hills overlooking American industrial facilities following the shock of Pearl Harbor. In January of 1942, United States Army anti-aircraft guns commandeered Seattle's city parks to defend against possible Japanese aerial attack. In February of that same year, more than 1,400 anti-aircraft shells were fired over the skies of Los Angeles during the famous Battle of Los Angeles, a night of panicked vigilance that, though ultimately directed at nothing more threatening than weather balloons and the shadows of collective fear, demonstrated vividly how seriously the nation took the threat of air attack on its own soil. By the late summer of 1945, all of that was supposed to be over. The war's end triggered one of the fastest and most dramatic demobilizations in recorded history. The United States Army, which had swelled to 8 million men at its peak, began shedding soldiers at a rate that astonished even its own planners. By June 30, 1947, barely 2 years after the guns fell silent, the Army had shrunk to just 684,000 men. 8 million to 600,000 in 24 months. The appetite for uniforms, for discipline, for the grinding mechanical routine of military service, had collapsed overnight under the weight of a nation desperate to come home, to build houses, to start families, to buy automobiles and refrigerators and all the bright, abundant things that wartime rationing had denied them. Anti-aircraft artillery battalions that had taken years to train and equip were dissolved by the stroke of a pen. Men who had spent thousands of hours mastering the relationship between radar directors, analog fire control computers, and the precise loading rhythm of a 90mm breech were handed discharge papers and wished well. The guns themselves faced a bureaucratic fate that was, in many ways, equally abrupt. Tens of thousands of pieces of heavy equipment. The guns, the radar vans, the director systems, the ammunition trailers, the power generators that ran the entire integrated fire control network, were declared war surplus. Some were shipped to friendly nations under the emerging framework of military assistance programs. Others were placed in storage at vast army depots, their barrels wrapped in cosmoline grease against the corrosion of idleness. A significant portion were simply scrapped, melted down into ingots of American steel at facilities that had, just months before, been producing the very same weapons at furious pace. The largest war surplus sale in American history processed tens of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and tons of equipment at prices that returned, as one contemporary account noted, barely 0.2 cents on the purchase dollar. The nation's fiscal guardians winced but accepted the loss as the cost of victory and the price of peace. For several years following the armistice, the continental United States existed in a condition that military historians have since described with a kind of stunned disbelief. The most powerful industrial nation on earth had, for all practical purposes, no meaningful anti-aircraft defense whatsoever. The radar networks that had once swept the coasts went dark or were reduced to skeleton crews. The fighter interceptor squadrons were gutted. The AAA battalions were gone. A population that had just 4 years earlier been drilling in civilian air raid procedures now slept without worry beneath an undefended sky. Because, after all, the enemies had been defeated, the Atlantic and Pacific were wide, and the atomic bomb, monopolized by Washington, seemed to render conventional air defense an academic concern. The world, however, was not finished reshaping itself. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The explosion, designated by American intelligence as Joe 1, sent a physical and psychological shockwave through Washington that no actual bomb had ever sent. 3 to 4 years ahead of what American planners had anticipated. 3 to 4 years in which the assumption of nuclear monopoly, that quiet, comfortable certainty that had allowed Truman to hold military budgets at peacetime levels while the factories retooled for washing machines, collapsed in a single morning. The Soviets had the bomb. And crucially, they also had the delivery vehicle. Their 2-4 bomber, a meticulous reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29 Superfortress, had been in service since 1947. It was a clumsy, costly aircraft by American standards, but it could fly over the polar ice cap and deposit a nuclear weapon on Chicago, on Detroit, on New York, on any of the great industrial arteries that made American civilization hum. The distance from Soviet airfields in Siberia to American cities via the polar route was well within its operational range. The shock was compounded the following year. In June 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel in a sudden, massive assault that caught the Western world profoundly off guard. Korea was not merely a local conflict in a distant peninsula. To American defense planners, it was a message, a Soviet-backed test of Western resolve, possibly a feint designed to draw American attention and resources eastward while the main blow fell elsewhere. The fear was not abstract, it was visceral, institutional, urgent. Within a week of the Korean invasion, the United States Air Force ordered around-the-clock operations in its air defense interceptor squadrons. And within days, almost immediately, the Army moved to reconstitute the anti-aircraft capability it had so hastily dismantled. In July of 1950, the Army Anti-Aircraft Command, ARICOM, was formally activated, initially consisting of a handful of officers working from the Pentagon. Its first commanding general, Major General Willard W. Irvine, was given a mission that was as simple in its statement as it was overwhelming in its practical dimensions: defend the critical areas of the continental United States from air attack. The Army had, at that moment, exactly 15 usable anti-aircraft artillery battalions on active duty. 15. For a nation of 150 million people, spread across a continent, with hundreds of vital industrial nodes, military bases, atomic production facilities, and population centers to protect. The gap between the mission and the means was staggering. What happened next was a story of emergency improvisation on a vast and largely unremembered scale. The WW2 era 90mm and 120mm guns, those same weapons that had been gathering dust in depots or being melted for scrap, were pulled back from storage, serviced, and redeployed. National Guard anti-aircraft battalions that had been organized in the late 1940s were federalized and rushed to defensive positions around the nation's most critical targets. By the end of 1951, the Army had expanded its AAA force to 45 battalions. By 1952, that number continued to grow, and gun batteries were emplaced in rings around Washington and Baltimore, Norfolk and Philadelphia, Chicago and Detroit, New York and Pittsburgh, Boston, Niagara Falls, and San Francisco. SAC bomber bases in Maine and California were ringed with steel. The plutonium production plant at Hanford, Washington, the atomic program's industrial heart, had received its first battery of 120mm guns as early as March 1950, before the Korean War even began. The human reality behind these deployments was extraordinary in its rawness. These were not elegant, purpose-built fortresses. They were emergency emplacements thrown together with whatever the Army had at hand. Battery D of the 18th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, for example, occupied a field 10 miles from the center of Detroit, close enough to hear the city's radio stations on a clear night, close enough to smell the industrial smoke that rolled off the automobile plants that had, just a decade before, been retooled to build tanks and aircraft. The field had no drainage. After any significant rainfall, vehicles sank to their axles in mud. There were no paved roads to the highway. There was no running water, no electricity, no permanent shelter. 100 soldiers lived in tents in that quagmire, eating field rations, hauling water, operating radar dishes and gun directors in conditions that their grandchildren would have found unimaginable. The VT-fused shells, those small, precisely machined instruments of deterrence, were stacked in waterproofed crates nearby, ready to be fed into the hungry britches of the 90mm guns on a moment's notice. Soldiers at these sites dug drainage ditches with their own hands. They laid gravel roads from scrounged materials. They built wooden floors beneath their tents to keep out the winter seep, and erected semi-permanent structures they called James Ways. Prefabricated shelter buildings that gave a veneer of permanence to what everyone understood was an improvised emergency. Army Chief of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, himself a decorated combat commander, offered the artillerymen little sympathy when complaints about conditions filtered up the chain of command. He remarked, in a moment of soldierly pragmatism, that it was about time the old Coast Artillery branch got a taste of real field life. The men accepted this. They had no other choice. The Cold War did not wait for comfort. The defensive perimeter they manned was, by any honest accounting, a response to a threat that had grown with terrifying speed. The Soviet Tu-4, capable of nuclear delivery via the polar route, was only the beginning. By 1955, Soviet Aviation Day parades in Moscow unveiled the Maya, for Bison, a swept-wing, jet-powered strategic bomber whose intercontinental range made the polar route not just feasible but practical. That same year, the smaller Tupolev Tu-16 Badger entered service in enormous numbers, followed shortly by the 4-turboprop Tu-95 Bear, a bomber that would prove so durable it remains in service to this day. Western analysts, processing the Soviet aviation display and extrapolating from what they believed they had seen, estimated that the Soviets would field between 600 and 700 strategic bombers by 1959. The bomber gap, later revealed to be largely a Soviet psychological deception, achieved by flying the same 10 Bison aircraft in repeated circles past the viewing stand, generated genuine terror in Washington and accelerated the expansion of American air defenses with an urgency that overrode nearly every budgetary constraint. And yet, even as those WW2 vintage guns stood sentinel in their muddy fields around Detroit and Chicago and the nation's capital, the men who understood the physics of modern warfare already knew the truth. The guns were fighting the last war. The jet age had arrived, where the propeller-driven aircraft of World War II had climbed to altitudes the 90mm could reach and at speeds the radar director systems could track. The new generation of Soviet jet bombers flew higher, faster, and in operational profiles that would saturate and overwhelm any gun-based defense the Army could deploy. A 90mm gun, however skillfully operated, however precisely directed by its radar and analog computer, fired a shell that traveled at a fixed velocity on a predictable trajectory. It could not maneuver. It could not chase. Once a target exceeded certain altitudes and certain speeds, the fundamental physics of ballistic gunnery became immovable obstacles. The shells arrived where the airplane had been, not where it was. This was a truth that American engineers had confronted with characteristic clarity and urgency. As early as May 14, 1945, barely 3 months before Japan's surrender, representatives of Bell Telephone Laboratories had presented to the Army Ordnance Corps the conceptual framework for something entirely new. They envisioned a guided missile, a 1,000-pound projectile, 19 feet in length, powered by a liquid fuel rocket motor, capable of reaching speeds that no shell could match, guided by 2 coordinated radars, one tracking the target, one tracking the missile, and a ground-based computer that continuously calculated the intercept point in real time. The missile could maneuver. The missile could chase. The missile could do what the 90mm shell, with all its magnificent precision, fundamentally could not. They called the project Nike, after the Greek goddess of victory. Development proceeded along parallel tracks through the late 1940s, betting on emerging technologies in rocketry, guidance electronics, and solid-state computing to mature simultaneously and converge into a working system. It was a gamble of extraordinary ambition. But American industrial and scientific culture had been calibrated by the war into an instrument of exactly this kind of accelerated development. Bell Laboratories, the same institution that had produced the M9 gun director and the SCR-584 microwave tracking radar that had made the 90mm batteries so lethal, poured its wartime expertise into the Nike program. By 1951, the first prototype firings were underway. By 1953, the system was declared operational. The Nike Ajax, as the first production variant was designated, was nothing less than a revolution in surface-to-air warfare, and it was deliberately designed to supplement and then replace the gun batteries that ARICOM had so hastily redeployed. It carried a fragmentation warhead equivalent in kill radius to hundreds of ET-fused gun shells arriving simultaneously. Its 2-stage propulsion system, a solid fuel booster that fell away after initial acceleration, followed by a liquid-fueled sustainer motor, drove the missile to speeds exceeding Mach 2.3. Its radar guidance system allowed the ground crew to steer it from a control trailer, watching 2 blips on a radar screen, target and missile, converge until detonation. The engagement timeline from detection to detonation was measured in seconds. The transition from guns to missiles began in earnest after 1953, and it proceeded with a deliberateness born of strategic necessity and the unforgiving mathematics of the nuclear age. Around each major defended area, Nike Ajax batteries were constructed in rings, typically 2 to 3 concentric rings of 4 to 6 launch sites each, positioned to provide overlapping coverage of approaches from multiple directions. Each site consisted of a launch area, buried underground, where missiles rested on elevators that raised them to surface launchers on command, an integrated fire control area, positioned separately for survivability, where the radar systems and guidance computers operated, and an administrative area for the soldiers who maintained and operated the system around the clock, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There was, in the words of one officer who served at Nike Site SF-88 in the Marin headlands above San Francisco Bay, no such thing as Christmas. The gun batteries they replaced were deactivated methodically, site by site, as Nike Ajax systems became operational around each defended area. The Pittsburgh defense, one of the most extensively documented, completed the deactivation of all anti-aircraft gun batteries by October of 1957, at which point the Nike missile system assumed full responsibility for the air defense of the region. This pattern was repeated across the country through the mid to late 1950s. The 90mm guns that had stood in the muddy fields outside Detroit, had occupied the parks of San Francisco, had ringed the capital of the nation, were dismounted from their emplacements, loaded onto flatbed trucks, and hauled away. Some went back to army depots. Some were transferred to allied nations under the Mutual Defense Assistance Act of 1949, which provided American military equipment to NATO partners and other friendly governments rebuilding their defenses against the Soviet threat. France, Turkey, and Canada received quantities of American 90mm guns for their own national defense needs. A number were preserved as static displays at military installations, veterans of foreign wars posts, and eventually museums, where their dark green paint and massive wheeled carriages still arrest the attention of those who pass by, suggesting without words the weight of the moment from which they came. And many simply became scrap metal, returning to the American economy in the form of steel ingots to be reborn as something more peaceful. On March 21, 1957, the Army Anti-Aircraft Command was formally redesignated as the Army Air Defense Command, ARADCOM. The word anti-aircraft was deliberately retired. The new name reflected a new reality. The command's mission had transcended the gun versus airplane duel that had defined anti-aircraft warfare from the First World War through the first decade of the Cold War. Air defense now meant missiles. It meant electronics. It meant the ability to engage targets not just at 30,000 feet but at 60,000 feet, not just at subsonic speeds but at twice the speed of sound. The language itself acknowledged the transformation. But the transformation did not stop with the Ajax. In 1958, the more powerful Nike Hercules began replacing the Ajax at existing sites. Where the Ajax had carried a conventional fragmentation warhead, the Hercules was designed to carry, and typically did carry, a nuclear warhead. The implication was stark and almost too large for the mind to absorb. Nuclear-armed surface-to-air missiles were deployed in rings around America's great cities, hidden underground in suburban neighborhoods, maintained by young soldiers in the backyards of the nation. At its peak, ARADCOM operated more than 240 missile sites across the continental United States, staffed by nearly 45,000 active duty and National Guard soldiers. The defended areas included not only military installations and industrial nodes, but the population centers themselves. New York, Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, San Francisco. The children growing up in those cities in the late 1950s and early 1960s were, in the most literal sense, sleeping within a few miles of nuclear warheads pointed skyward, maintained in constant readiness by men who took their post with a seriousness that bordered on the devotional. October 1957 brought Sputnik, the Soviet satellite that circled the Earth in 90 minutes and, in doing so, annihilated the assumption that the American homeland was separated from Soviet military reach by the vast mercy of oceanic distance. The beeping signal of that small aluminum sphere, received on radio receivers across the United States, was not just a technological milestone. It was the sound of a paradigm collapsing. An intercontinental ballistic missile could carry a nuclear warhead from Soviet soil to an American city in less time than it took a man to eat breakfast. No gun could intercept it. No Nike Ajax could intercept it. Even the nuclear-tipped Nike Hercules, designed to detonate its warhead in the midst of a formation of attacking bombers, was impotent against a ballistic trajectory that arced from one continent to another at altitudes and velocities entirely beyond the reach of any surface-to-air weapon then in existence. The Army understood this. The Nike program had always been intended as a defense against the Soviet manned bomber threat. And that threat, while it did not disappear overnight, was increasingly supplemented and in the strategic calculus eventually overshadowed by the missile threat. The Army pursued the Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missile concept through the 1960s, and the debate over whether a viable ABM defense could be constructed occupied a generation of engineers, strategists, and politicians. AIRDCOM retained its mission and its Nike Hercules batteries throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, maintaining the vigil against the Soviet bomber force that never came. Its motto, "Vigilant and Invincible," was not ironic. It was a plain statement of intent, honored daily by tens of thousands of soldiers who served in conditions far removed from the dramatic imagery of conventional combat but no less demanding in their rigor and their consequence. The final chapter was written quietly. As the Soviet manned bomber threat diminished in relative strategic significance, as the ICBM became the dominant instrument of nuclear exchange, and as the immense cost of maintaining hundreds of active missile sites across the continent grew increasingly difficult to justify against competing national priorities, AIRDCOM began the long process of deactivation. Site by site, the Nike Hercules batteries were shut down, the missiles were disarmed, the underground launchers were sealed, and the soldiers were reassigned. On April 1, 1974, the last Nike Hercules battery was inactivated. The Army Air Defense Command, the direct institutional descendant of those mud-soaked AAA battalions that had stood in the fields outside Detroit with their WW2 era 90mm guns pointed at a sky from which the Soviet bear never came, ceased to exist as an operational command. 24 years. From the first deployment of WW2 vintage anti-aircraft guns around the Hanford plutonium plant in March 1950, to the inactivation of the last Nike Hercules site in 1974, 24 years of continuous, unbroken readiness. 24 years of soldiers who worked through every holiday, every winter storm, every budget crisis and political upheaval, maintaining a deterrent that succeeded precisely because it was never tested. The measure of AIRDCOM's success, as one of its historians dryly noted, was the number of Soviet attacks on the United States during those 24 years, 0. The guns themselves, those magnificent, awkward, enormously expensive instruments of industrial democracy, rested in museums and on courthouse lawns and outside VFW halls across the continent, their barrels pointed at a sky now crossed not by Soviet bombers but by commercial airliners full of ordinary people going about the ordinary business of lives lived in freedom. The 90mm M2, the direct descendant of the weapon that had shot down the German V-1 rockets over the English Channel and had stood in the mud outside the great American cities, could be found at the Air Defense Artillery Museum at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and at Fort Bliss in Texas, and at a dozen other locations, silent, preserved, painted in the flat olive drab of their era. Tourists walked past them with the casual interest of people who do not know the weight of what they are looking at. But the weight is there. Consider the small, cylindrical object that is the key to understanding the entire arc of this history, the VT proximity fuse shell. That little radio transmitter, developed in secrecy by the National Defense Research Committee and mass-produced in the tens of millions by American industry, had been inserted into the nose of virtually every 90mm shell fired by AIRDCOM's gun batteries. It was not merely a technical marvel, it was a philosophical statement. It said that the defense of a free society could be achieved not by the sacrifice of its citizens, not by the piling of human bodies against the tide of totalitarian aggression, but by the application of democratic ingenuity, mass production, and the organizational genius of a society that trusted its engineers and its workers and its soldiers to solve problems that no single human being could solve alone. The VT fuse was not invented by a single genius. It was invented by an ecosystem, universities, private laboratories, government agencies, and factory floors, working in coordinated urgency toward a common purpose. It worked 89 times out of 91 against the most fearsome automated weapons then in existence. It worked because of who made it, and why, and how. That same spirit, the spirit of coordinated, industrialized, democratically organized defense, animated everything that followed. The Nike Ajax was not a triumph of any individual mind. It was the output of Bell Telephone Laboratories, the Army Ordnance Corps, dozens of prime contractors, and thousands of machinists and engineers and test crews working in parallel, betting simultaneously on multiple emerging technologies, trusting that the collective output would converge in time. It was, in microcosm, exactly what American democracy looked like when it was working at its best: distributed intelligence, shared purpose, and the confidence born of past success. The same factories that had built the 90mm guns now retooled for missile components. The same soldiers who had mastered radar gunlaying now mastered missile guidance. The institution adapted because the institution was designed to adapt. Not because it was ordered to be flexible, but because the culture that produced it, the culture of a free and inventive people, was constitutionally incapable of remaining static in the face of a changing threat. The story of America's anti-aircraft gun batteries after World War II is not, at its heart, a story about guns or missiles or radar systems. It is a story about vigilance as a form of love. The love that a society expresses for itself when it accepts that freedom is not a gift that, once received, requires no further maintenance. The men who had manned the 90mm guns in the mud outside Detroit in the winter of 1952, eating field rations and digging drainage ditches and peering into radar scopes beneath the orange industrial sky, were not heroes in any cinematic sense. No one celebrated them. No parades were organized in their honor. The civilians living 10 miles away in the warmth of their houses did not know these men were there, did not know that the perimeter within which they slept and raised their children was drawn in steel and radar and the determined watchfulness of young soldiers who had accepted, without complaint, a post that history would largely forget. But they were there. And because they were there, because the 90mm guns were deployed to those fields, because the Nike Ajax batteries followed them, because ARIDCOM maintained its vigil without interruption for 24 years, the thing they were guarding against never came. A nuclear device never fell on Chicago. A Soviet bomber never reached New York. The plutonium plant at Hanford processed its material undisturbed. The SAC bases launched their deterrent patrols from runways that no enemy aircraft ever cratered. The guns are quiet now. The missile sites are parks, some of them, hiking trails winding past the sealed concrete of underground launch chambers, interpretive signs explaining to curious visitors what these strange rectangular depressions in the landscape once contained. At Fort Barry in the Marin Headlands, the restored Nike Site SF-88 stands as the only preserved Nike missile installation in the United States, where volunteers maintain the launchers and the radar equipment in something approaching operational condition, and where schoolchildren come on field trips to stand in the underground launch area and feel, for a moment, the weight of the Cold War pressing down from above. The proximity fuse shell sits in display cases at military museums. Small, unremarkable to the untrained eye. A cylinder of machined metal with a radio transmitter inside, the symbol of everything that the American anti-aircraft gun represented, not the romance of the warrior, not the aesthetics of individual courage, but the deep, democratic, industrial truth that a free people, organized in common purpose, with its engineers trusted and its workers paid and its soldiers respected, can build a shield that holds not forever, not against every conceivable threat, but long enough, strong enough, steadily enough to buy the time that freedom needs to renew and reassert itself. The sky above the old gun emplacements is quiet. The radar dishes are long dismantled. The young men who loaded those shells, who felt in their hands the solid weight of that proximity fuse round, who heard the crack and thunder of the breech and felt the gun recoil beneath them, are old now, or gone. But what they built with those hands, what they defended with those guns, what they sustained through 24 years of cold and mud and peacetime vigilance, endures in the cities that rose undisturbed behind them, in the schools those cities built, in the hospitals, in the factories and libraries and concert halls and baseball stadiums, in the ordinary, abundant, gloriously uninterrupted life of a democracy that was guarded, in its most vulnerable decades, by men with guns pointed at the sky. That is what really happened to America's anti-aircraft gun batteries after the Second World War. They became something larger than weapons. They became proof.